Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere cold, silent, and heavy with incense, somewhere most people will never be allowed to enter. You're not in a dungeon, technically, but it might as well be one. You're walking beneath the Vatican, past marble saints, unlocked wooden doors, down into the archives they call Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. Over 50 kilometers of shelves, over 1,000 years of memory selectively curated. The air is still, but your skin prickles. The lighting is soft, almost too soft, like even the bulbs are sworn to secrecy. You brush your hand along the edge of a wooden case and feel the grain of a locked world. No security cameras, no flashing warnings, just silence and the unmistakable weight of things you were never meant to know. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you listening from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink, and suddenly you're holding a parchment, not because you're allowed to, but because someone forgot to hide it in time. Its corners are worn, and the ink smells like dried myrrh. Latin, yes, but not the clean, approved Latin of catechisms. This one's older, angrier. It doesn't praise. It protests. The first page isn't about Jesus at all. It's about what came after and how history was cleaned. Libraries torched, but not for warmth, words erased one careful letter at a time. In Constantinople, Damascus, Alexandria scribes once wrote with fire in their fingers. But after the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, something good happened. Not chaos, not war, just quiet. Historians still argue whether this silence was real, or whether it was engineered. Because suddenly, the only scribes left were monks. And the only stories they copied were the ones that passed a new kind of test, not of truth, but of usefulness. Your feet crunch gravel as you step into a side vault. A monk's robe rustles behind a curtain, but when you look, nothing. Still, the dust here speaks louder than the Vatican's press office ever could. Let's talk facts. We know the Church preserved many ancient texts. Without their efforts, we might have lost much of Aristotle, Galen, and Plato, but preservation isn't the same as distribution. These weren't bestsellers on the street. They were locked behind Latin. Few could read doctrinal Latin, warped over time to say what it needed to say. And guess what? If a text had the wrong flavor, it wasn't copied. If it contradicted the gospel according to Rome, it was branded apocryphal, that lovely word that doesn't mean false, just inconvenient. One quirky tidbit. In the 13th century, monks referred to books they couldn't copy as obscura, not because they were evil, but because they were dangerous to the faith of a tired peasant who'd never seen a map wider than a parish. Now here's where it gets fun. There are no blueprints for the archive. The layout is a mystery even to most within the Church. Even the popes only see parts of it. Some scholars claim there are entire rooms of documents that haven't been touched in 500 years. They're catalogued by symbols, not titles. Some require 3 signatures to access. One rumor suggests a shelf of non-canon Gospels was sealed behind a wall during the Reformation just in case someone got curious. And you're curious, of course you are. So you reach up to the next shelf. The leather creaks. The book is thin, fragile. It's not titled. You open it and read a single line. It says, "He who speaks the truth must never speak it twice." You're not sure who wrote that. It's unsigned, but the meaning lands hard. Maybe truth isn't buried. Maybe it's just whispered once, then silence forever. Remember that line, because this isn't just a history lesson. This is a night walk through the cracks, and the next crack is shaped exactly like a man whose name has been dragged through fire for 2,000 years, of Judas, but more on him in a moment. You never expected to feel sorry for Judas. No one ever does. From Sunday school to paintings in grand cathedrals, he's the man who sold the Son of God for 30 silver coins and a forgettable footnote in the gospel choir. But here, in this dim vault beneath Vatican marble, you find a version of Judas that doesn't quite match the one you were taught to scorn. You run your finger down the curling script of a leather-bound gospel, not Matthew, not Mark. It says the Gospel of Judas, and no, it's not a joke. It's a real manuscript, discovered in the 1970s, possibly written as early as the 2nd century, buried in a cave in Egypt, and then tucked away in silence for centuries. The text is strange, haunting. Judas isn't the villain. He's the only disciple who understands what Jesus is really saying. And Jesus, he's laughing, a lot. Not because he's happy, but because no one understands him. Except Judas. In this version, Jesus asks Judas to betray him. Not out of treachery, but out of love. He tells him, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." And just like that, the whole narrative shifts. Maybe Judas wasn't the betrayer. Maybe he was the only one who saw the whole picture, and that made him dangerous. Historians still argue whether this gospel was part of an early Gnostic movement, a symbolic text, or simply an elaborate theological prank. But the Church's response, complete and immediate rejection, branded heretical, filed away. For safety, you take a deep breath. The dust here tastes metallic, like old arguments and lost names. Now imagine being a medieval peasant. You barely speak your village's dialect, let alone Latin, and yet you're told to hate Judas. You're taught one story, one version, one path, every other road, every gospel that offers nuance, doubt, or paradox. Gone, all locked in this vault. Here's a quirky detail. In a few early Christian sects, Judas wasn't just tolerated, he was honored. There's even some debate about whether the Judas of the canonical Gospels is a composite character, a symbol of betrayal, rather than a literal man. Some scholars argue that in Hebrew, Yehuda could have functioned as a metaphor for the people who didn't recognize Jesus' spiritual revolution. It's like assigning a name to an idea and then crucifying it forever. You pull the manuscript closer and squint at the bottom. A marginal note, maybe 1,800 years old, written in tiny red ink. He who is cursed may be closest to the light. You blink. That's something no monk would leave behind casually. But don't worry. That won't end up in your Sunday reading packet. The room you're in now is silent, but your thoughts are loud. How many other figures from history have been flattened into symbols just to make the story cleaner? How many times have we chosen the simple narrative good versus evil, betrayal versus loyalty, just because it's easier to swallow before bed? You think about modern portrayals. Judas is always sweating, always scowling, always shifty-eyed and alone. No nuance, no inner voice, no torment, and certainly no gospel in his name. But here you are, holding it. One mainstream fact: the Gospel of Judas was officially translated and published in 2006, and while it caused a brief media flurry, the Church dismissed it as theological fiction. They didn't burn it. They didn't need to. Silence is stronger. And silence echoes. You lean back against the wall of the archive and close your eyes. It's not that the Church lied, necessarily. They just chose which parts to tell, which voices to pass forward, and which to lock behind. Doors you're not supposed to open. But tonight, you opened one. And now, you hear someone else's footsteps echoing down the corridor. Light steps, bare feet, another figure in a robe. This time, not Judas. It's someone else they tried to erase. And she doesn't kneel. She teaches. You don't hear her before you feel her presence. A hush, a calm defiance. She doesn't knock or bow. She simply arrives like someone who's spent centuries waiting to be found. Mary Magdalene. And no, not the mascara streak sinner Hollywood loves, not the fallen woman draped across Renaissance canvases, like an apology. Tonight, you're meeting the version they buried beneath 1,000 years of doctrine. The one with ink-stained hands, a sharp mind, and a gospel that shouldn't exist, but does. It's called the Gospel of Mary, not Mary the Mother. Mary Magdalene, a voice, at last, from someone who walked with Jesus, not behind him, not at his feet, but beside him. The first line you read says, simply, Peter said to Mary, "Sister, we know the Saviour loved you more than the rest of us." Historians still argue whether this gospel reflects the beliefs of a lost sect or was a later Gnostic addition. But one thing is clear: whoever wrote it saw Mary not as a witness, but as a teacher. In this gospel, after Jesus' death, the disciples panic, they fall into fear. And it's Mary who stands and reminds them of the path, of his words, of the real message. Imagine that for a moment. Peter, who later becomes the first pope, asks Mary what Jesus meant in secret. She tells him, calmly, confidently. And how does he respond? With jealousy. He says, "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not with us?" Then Levi, another disciple, rebukes Peter. If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her? You lower the parchment and exhale. This is not Sunday school, quirky detail. In early Christian art, Mary was often painted wearing red, not because she was a woman of sin, but because red symbolized wisdom, authority, and priesthood. The narrative shifted only centuries later, especially under Pope Gregory I in the 6th century, who publicly identified her with the sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet. Just like that, the teacher became the penitent. But you can still trace the original respect if you know where to look. Some Gnostic texts refer to her as Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. Think about that. She was the messenger to the messengers, the one who kept the light when the others scattered. And yet, her gospel was excluded, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. It spoke of divine knowledge coming from within, not through priests, rituals, or official channels. It taught that sin isn't a violation of rules, but a misunderstanding of our true nature, that the kingdom isn't somewhere in the clouds, but already here. If only we remember who we are. That's not the kind of message that fills collection plates. You brush your thumb across the edge of the gospel, the pages smell of iron and almond oil. It's shorter than the others, incomplete, missing chunks. Some say it was never fully transcribed. Others believe parts were deliberately destroyed. A page here, a sentence there, just enough to keep the meaning broken. Still, what survives is enough to reshape everything. You begin to wonder, what if Mary was the one Jesus trusted most? What if the resurrection story begins with her not because she was available, but because she was chosen? What if leadership was never about bloodlines, but clarity, mainstream fact? The Gospel of Mary was discovered in the late 19th century, but wasn't published in full until 1955. Even then, it was ignored for decades, treated as spiritual folklore rather than history. But today, more scholars are quietly re-examining its weight, asking whether Christianity must have had more female voices before those voices were edited out. And here comes the rub. It's not that Mary's gospel was denied. It was disregarded, a soft, bureaucratic erasure. No bonfire, no execution, just a whispered, "This isn't important," and into the shadows it went. You glance back at the previous shelf, Judas, now Mary, both miscast, both reshaped for convenience. And, behind both, you start to see the pattern: edit the past, shape the future, eliminate the radicals, canonize the obedient. You stand, your legs feel heavier now, because you know what's coming next. If people like Judas and Mary were redacted, if time itself is being massaged, then the rot runs deeper. It's not just the people. It's the structure. And the next shelf doesn't hold a gospel. It holds a calendar. And the date on it isn't what you think it is. Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere cold, silent, and heavy with incense, somewhere most people will never be allowed to enter. You're not in a dungeon, technically, but it might as well be one. You're walking beneath the Vatican, past marble saints, unlocked wooden doors, down into the archives they call Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. Over 50 kilometers of shelves, over 1,000 years of memory selectively curated. The air is still, but your skin prickles. The lighting is soft, almost too soft, like even the bulbs are sworn to secrecy. You brush your hand along the edge of a wooden case and feel the grain of a locked world. No security cameras, no flashing warnings, just silence and the unmistakable weight of things you were never meant to know. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you listening from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink, and suddenly you're holding a parchment, not because you're allowed to, but because someone forgot to hide it in time. Its corners are worn, and the ink smells like dried myrrh. Latin, yes, but not the clean, approved Latin of catechisms. This one's older, angrier. It doesn't praise. It protests. The first page isn't about Jesus at all. It's about what came after and how history was cleaned. Libraries torched, but not for warmth. Words erased one careful letter at a time. In Constantinople, Damascus, Alexandria scribes once wrote with fire in their fingers. But after the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, something good happened. Not chaos, not war, just quiet. Historians still argue whether this silence was real, or whether it was engineered. Because suddenly, the only scribes left were monks. And the only stories they copied were the ones that passed a new kind of test, not of truth, but of usefulness. Your feet crunch gravel as you step into a side vault. A monk's robe rustles behind a curtain, but when you look, nothing. Still, the dust here speaks louder than the Vatican's press office ever could. Let's talk facts. We know the Church preserved many ancient texts. Without their efforts, we might have lost much of Aristotle, Galen, and Plato, but preservation isn't the same as distribution. These weren't bestsellers on the street. They were locked behind Latin. Few could read doctrinal Latin, warped over time to say what it needed to say. And guess what? If a text had the wrong flavor, it wasn't copied. If it contradicted the gospel according to Rome, it was branded apocryphal. That lovely word that doesn't mean false, just inconvenient. One quirky tidbit. In the 13th century, monks referred to books they couldn't copy as obscura, not because they were evil, but because they were dangerous to the faith of a tired peasant who'd never seen a map wider than a parish. Now here's where it gets fun. There are no blueprints for the archive. The layout is a mystery even to most within the church. Even the popes only see parts of it. Some scholars claim there are entire rooms of documents that haven't been touched in 500 years. They're catalogued by symbols, not titles. Some require 3 signatures to access. One rumor suggests a shelf of non-canon gospels was sealed behind a wall during the Reformation just in case someone got curious. And you're curious, of course you are. So you reach up to the next shelf. The leather creaks. The book is thin, fragile. It's not titled. You open it and read a single line. It says, "He who speaks the truth must never speak it twice." You're not sure who wrote that. It's unsigned, but the meaning lands hard. Maybe truth isn't buried. Maybe it's just whispered once, then silence forever. Remember that line, because this isn't just a history lesson. This is a night walk through the cracks, and the next crack is shaped exactly like a man whose name has been dragged through fire for 2,000 years, of Judas. But more on him in a moment. You're starting to feel it now, that slow, creeping realization that what you thought was history might actually be theater. Not the bad kind with wigs and fake beards, but the kind where the set is made of parchment, and the actors are names. You were told never to question. And now you're standing in the writer's room. It's dimly lit, of course. You wouldn't want too much light in a place like this. Ink fades under scrutiny. Truth does too, apparently. Before you is a wooden desk. A candle still smoulders. A scrap of vellum curls like it's exhaling. And there, poised forever in mid-thought, is a quill. Welcome to the scriptorium, the quiet room, where history was not recorded, but revised. You lean in. The monk across the desk, thin, hooded, eyes like iron filings, doesn't look up. He's copying from an older manuscript, line by line, but it's not a perfect copy. You see the edits. Words removed, whole sections rephrased. Marginal notes like, this line invites doubt, delete, or, overly sympathetic to Judas, reframe. This is how theology became typography. Mainstream fact. During the early Middle Ages, scriptoria writing rooms in monasteries were the only places in Europe where books were produced. There were no printing presses. Each book took months, sometimes years, to finish. Mistakes weren't crossed out, they were scratched away, scraped from the page with a knife called a scraper, or covered with illustrations. And sometimes those mistakes were ideas. Here's a quirky example. In a 9th century manuscript of the Gospel of Luke, a line was altered to change the meaning of Christ's resurrection. The original phrase implying a spiritual resurrection was rewritten to insist on a bodily return. Scholars later found ghost traces of the original under ultraviolet light. Historians still argue whether this was a simple error or doctrinal censorship, but honestly, would you leave that much up to chance? You glance to your left, a stack of rejected texts. Not burned, not destroyed, just set aside. Among them, the Gospel of Mary, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Paul, and Thecla, books that painted Jesus as a mystic, a teacher, a symbol of inner light rather than external authority. Books that didn't end with "and then the church was founded." The monk finally looks up. His face is hollowed by time, but his eyes are clear. He doesn't speak. He just slides a piece of parchment toward you. It says, "The truth is what survives the editing process." You don't know whether to laugh or cry, because it's true. There's something uniquely haunting about the fact that most of what we know about the first centuries after Jesus comes from documents copied centuries later by people with an agenda, people who believed they were protecting faith by shaping it. The church didn't need to fabricate Jesus, they just needed to frame him. And over time, every gospel that emphasized personal awakening, feminine authority, or non-hierarchical spirituality was quietly retired to vague, to empowering, to dangerous. You notice something else. The Latin here isn't the same as the Latin of Caesar or Cicero. This is ecclesiastical Latin, narrower, stricter, designed not for poetry or law, but for command, where classical Latin had 30+ ways to say light. This Latin has 2, and they both imply revelation under control. And the people copying these words, they weren't historians, they were theologians. Their job wasn't to preserve ambiguity, it was to clarify, to simplify, to purify. To fix the story. You remember that missing Gospel of Judas, the words he spoke. The Gospel of Mary, the jealousy of Peter. None of it survives here. Not in the clean texts, only in the margins, and that's where you are now. The margins of history. You step out of the scriptorium and into a hallway where the air feels a little colder. The walls don't echo anymore. You feel like you're walking through a silence built over centuries, not an accident, a design. And as you turn the corner, you hear something strange, a ticking, faint, rhythmic, mechanical. It's not a clock, but it might be time itself, and it doesn't belong to the church. It belongs to the stars. Tick, tick, tick. You follow the sound, deeper into the archive, where marble gives way to stone, and stone gives way to something older and something that feels like it predates even memory. The ticking isn't loud, but it's steady, like a heartbeat. that never learn to lie. It's not coming from a machine. It's coming from the sky. A celestial clock. Tonight, you're stepping outside parchment and pulpit. Because while ink fades and empires fall, stars don't forget, eclipses don't. Lee, and orbital mechanics doesn't care what year the Pope says it is. You step into a dome chamber. Above you, a massive astrolabe hangs like a frozen constellation, bronze, arms pointing to stars that no longer shine, dates etched into its curves like scars. Below it, on a pedestal, sits a medieval star chart, beautiful, fragile, annotated. And terribly inconvenient, because the dates written next to eclipses on this chart don't line up with the Church's official timeline. Not even close. Mainstream fact. Astronomers can calculate past eclipses with mathematical precision. If an eclipse was visible over Europe in 754 AD, it should be visible in modern simulations. But when researchers compare ancient observations, Greek, Chinese, Arabic with European church records, something odd happens. The European data drifts. Entire celestial events are off by decades, sometimes centuries. Historians still argue whether these discrepancies are due to scribal error, calendar transitions, or something more deliberate. But the pattern persists, and patterns, as you know, tend to mean something. You stare at the chart. One eclipse, in particular, is labeled as occurring in 632 AD, the year after Muhammad's death. It's recorded in Islamic and Chinese sources, but in the Church's records, silence. No mention. No visibility. Nothing. As if the moon simply forgot to pass the sun that day. You glance back up at the astrolabe. It wasn't built by monks. It was likely crafted by Arab scholars during the Abbasid Caliphate, a time when Baghdad had streetlights, public libraries, and surgeries, while Europe was still arguing about whether bathing was sinful. Quirky tidbit. The Vatican once operated its own astronomical observatory, Specola Vaticana, staffed by Jesuit astronomers. But their findings were tightly controlled. When their calculations conflicted with doctrine, especially during the Galileo affair, those charts disappeared faster than you can say heliocentric. Because, let's face it, when the sky contradicts your timeline, you can't edit the stars, but you can edit the records. You step closer to the pedestal and find a second star chart, this one much older. Greek, maybe even Babylonian. The ink is barely there, but the geometry is flawless. One note in the corner reads, "The heavens do not forget what men conceal." And that's when it hits you. Maybe the Vatican didn't just control stories. Maybe they tried to control time. By adjusting calendars, erasing years, and smoothing out rough transitions, the Church could present itself as the continuous light in a dark world, the only institution that had survived from ancient times, the only keeper of order. Its genius, really. If time flows through your hands, you don't need swords, you just need dates, a year here, a pope there, an eclipse that didn't happen, a king who reigned before he was born. It all works. If no one's checking the sky, you remember Galileo now, forced to recant, not because he was wrong, but because he refused to play along. They told him to say the earth was still, and then they locked him in his house for the rest of his life. Not with chains, but with the weight of silence. You take a step back. Your foot bumps against something under the dust, a stone plaque, maybe. You brush it off, carved into the surface, a quote, Latin first, then Greek, then English. Time belongs to no man, but memory can be leased. It doesn't say by whom, but you already know. The calendar you follow, the holidays you observe, the way you date the birth of your child or the founding of your nation. It all passes through this invisible hand. You were born in 2025, but maybe it's 1725, or maybe it's year one of a world that was never meant to wake up. You exhale, and for the first time tonight, you stop walking, because if the stars don't lie, and the archives do, then it's not time you need to track. It to rewrote it. And why? You step away from the astrolabe, its ancient limbs still ticking inside your skull. Your breath is slow now. Your footsteps echo less like sound and more like memory. And then you see it. Not a book. Not a relic. A door set into the stone wall. Like a whisper. Its frame barely wider than your shoulders. No handle. Just an inscription, carved so faintly it might have been hidden on purpose. Chronologia est opinio potentis. Chronology is the opinion of the powerful. Of course it is. You press your palm to the stone. Nothing happens because this isn't a magic door. This is a metaphor, but you walk through it anyway. And what you find is what history class never had. Time to mention, a hallway of forged centuries. Mainstream fact. In the late 20th century, a group of scholars and researchers, led by a man named Herbert Illich, proposed the phantom time hypothesis, a theory claiming that nearly 300 years of medieval history never happened. Specifically, from 614 to 911 AD. According to them, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII conspired to fabricate this period in order to legitimize Otto's rule as occurring in the millennial year 1000. Their evidence to many overlapping rulers, to few advancements in architecture, agriculture, or astronomy. And most importantly, a suspicious gap in archaeology. Very few artifacts, coins, or reliable documents from that period survive in Western Europe. Historians still argue whether this theory holds any water. Most mainstream academics reject it outright. But here's the thing, even they agree there was some chronological tampering in history. Just not 300 years worth. But what if it wasn't one big lie? What if it was a series of small edits, incremental, strategic, wrapped in the velvet of restoration and translation, designed to reshape the spine of time itself? You peer into the dim corridor. The air changes. It's colder here. And quieter. You see timelines, actual ones drawn on the walls like murals. The further back you look, the weirder they get. One timeline shows Jesus crucified under Pontius Pilate. Around 33 AD, that's the one you know. But 2 murals over, it shows the same event, happening in 1203 AD, under the name Isabin. Maryam, in Islamic texts. Another shows the same teachings attributed to Apollonius of Charna, a wandering philosopher who lived around the same time, performed miracles, and had a suspiciously gospel-like biography. You feel your heart ticking again, like a metronome caught in a lie, and you remember the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas. They all depict Jesus in ways that feel older, not bound to a specific empire, not part of a structured church, more like a timeless idea than a man on a timeline. And maybe that's the problem. Ideas are harder to kill. But if you bind them to a date, to a century, to a king, you can control how they're remembered. You can say, this happened here, and nowhere else. You can lock truth to a year, then move the year. Quirky detail. The Gregorian calendar you use today, adopted in 1582 by Pope Gregory XIII, was meant to fix a 10-day drift in the Julian calendar caused by inaccurate leap years. But not everyone adopted it at once. In fact, Britain didn't switch until 1752, and some countries waited even longer. So 4 centuries. Different regions operated on different timelines, each one calling the other wrong. It's like history was an open document, and everyone had editing access. You lean closer to a mural that depicts the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the meeting where church officials finalized many of the doctrines you now take for granted. Trinity, divinity, the canon of acceptable Gospels. But something's off. This version shows additional attendees, people in strange robes, symbols that don't belong to Rome, notes in Aramaic. The caption, the witnesses who were removed from memory. You blink. Because for every story you know, there are versions you've never seen, not because they were disproven, but because they were outvoted. You're not walking through history, You're walking through what history was allowed to become. The hallway opens now, into a chamber lit by dozens of mismatched candles, some new, some ancient. Their wax puddles into shapes on the floor, and suddenly, it looks like a map of time. Some roads lead forward, others double back, one or to go. Nowhere dots and scrawled in the corner, like a warning. Do not trust any era that has no shadow. You, sit down, because at this point, your legs are tired and your trust as calluses, and as your back rests against a wall that once kept out heresy, you think, if time itself was rewritten, what else was? You don't fall asleep, but something close, you drift, because this chamber doesn't keep time, the way clocks do. It hums with hours that never made it onto calendars. Time, in here, is something older, something tactile. You could fold it. If you dared, you could pocket it. And maybe that's exactly what someone did. You rub your eyes, glance toward the wall, and see a wooden instrument resting under a velvet cloth. It's covered in dust, but the shape is unmistakable. An armillary sphere, the kind ancient astronomers used to model the heavens. A symbol of divine order. Only this one has something wrong. You wipe off a strip of grime. Its rings, meant to represent the planets, are off by a few degrees. The sun isn't in the center. And Mercury, it's too close. That's not an accident. That's a cover up. Mainstream fact. In 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar, it was primarily a response to a drift in the Julian calendar. Over centuries, the calendar had fallen 10 full days out of sync with the equinox, affecting the calculation of Easter. But fixing the dates required manipulating time. 10 days were erased. October 4th, 1582, was immediately followed by October 15. Whole weeks vanished overnight. Some peasants thought the Pope had stolen days from their lives, and to be fair, he had. Historians still argue whether this change was purely astronomical, or whether it carried political motives too. After all, the Church had enormous power over not just faith, but measurement, timekeeping, and reality itself. But here's the bit they don't teach you in school. Eclipses didn't match up. After the calendar change, historical records of eclipses used to date past events no longer aligned perfectly with calculations. Astronomers had to fudge numbers, smooth over inconsistencies, or outright discard certain ancient texts as inaccurate. But what if they weren't? What if the stars had it right, and we got lost? You look up now. The ceiling in this chamber isn't stone. It's glass. And beyond it, a painted sky, centuries old, showing constellations in positions they haven't held for 1,000 years. But here's the twist: when you squint, when your eyes adjust, you realize they still line up, just in the wrong year. This room isn't just out of sync with modern time. It's in sync with a different one. You pick up a book, its spine reads, "The Pope Who Never Was." The pages are cracked with age, but the story they tell feels new. There was once a Pontiff, John the 20th, supposedly reigning in the 11th century, whose name appears in multiple church documents. His seal is pressed into letters, his laws cited, his papal tiara supposedly buried in St. Peter's. Only one issue: he never existed. There's no grave. No contemporary reference. Just a paper trail with no human behind it. It's like someone invented him to fill a gap. A quirky footnote. In the list of popes, the Vatican skips directly from John the 19th to John the 21st. There is no John the 20th. Church officials chalk it up to a clerical error. Sure, a 1,000-year-old typo, because nothing screams divine infallibility like a papal spreadsheet. Mistake. You flip further. The book explains how phantom rulers, fabricated councils, and edited lineages were used to stitch together a cohesive church history, one that would connect Peter directly to Rome, unbroken, uninterrupted, and eternal. But what if that thread was added later? What if parts of history were retrofitted like insulation in a leaky house, patching over holes with saints who never lived, emperors who never ruled, and years that were nothing more than narrative glue. You close the book, your hands tremble slightly, because this isn't about a date being wrong. It's about reality being edited. You glance again at the armillary sphere. On its base, a single phrase is carved in Latin: Veritas non dormit, tempus, mentita, truth doesn't sleep, time lies. And suddenly, you understand. You haven't been descending into the past. You've been climbing out of a script, a history that's less of a record and more of a performance. And now the stage lights are flickering. You're standing at the edge of the world now. Not a map, not a globe, but the edge of a story. It curls at the corners like burned parchment, and on the other side isn't oblivion, it's silence. A deep, carefully engineered silence, one that starts with a calendar. A ringing bell echoes through the chamber, distant but precise, like a monastery chime or the sound of an empire resetting its watch. You follow it, down a narrow passage lit by flickering lamps, each mounted beneath carved wooden plaques. Each plaque holds a year: 614, 800.997, 1024. You run your fingers along them, one by one, until you reach a gap, a missing plaque, 3 centuries wide. Mainstream fact: in the 1990s, a German historian named Heribert Illig proposed a phantom time hypothesis, suggesting that nearly 300 years of history, specifically from AD 614 to 911, were fabricated. Inserted. Imagine. According to Illig, the Holy Roman Emperor Arthur III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII conspired to rewrite the timeline. Why? To place themselves at the magical year 1000, a numerological milestone that never actually happened. Historians still argue whether Illig's theory has any real merit or if it's just clever madness. The archaeological record, after all, does show things like buildings, artifacts, and tombs from those centuries, but Illig pointed out that much of that evidence is scarce, oddly consistent, and sometimes suspiciously circular dating methods that rely on documents, which rely on calendars, which were rewritten. It's like trying to verify a dream by checking your watch. Inside the dream, and the deeper you go into this theory, the more inconvenient anomalies pile up. A Romanesque style of architecture appears before it's supposed to. Charlemagne, the grand founder of medieval Europe, has an impossible life too. Many achievements for one man, with too many inconsistencies in his records, coins minted in his name as those from centuries apart. And when scholars tried to find physical astronomical events like eclipses or comets to confirm timelines, during those phantom centuries, the stars fell. Oddly silent, quirky tidbit: a medieval chronicle once described a comet passing between Mars and the Moon, but astronomers later determined such a thing was physically impossible. Either the writer was hallucinating, or he was describing an event that never happened because the date itself was fiction. You feel a chill as you step into the space between the plaques. There's no floor here, only an illusion of footing, like walking over erased pencil marks. You reach out and touch the wall. It's smooth, artificial. This isn't a missing page. It's a redacted one. You realize something else. All the dark ages you learned about in school, the bleak centuries where supposedly nothing happened, where Europe was illiterate, superstitious, and backward, those ages overlap almost perfectly with Illig's phantom centuries. That's convenient, isn't it? A whole era defined by lack of innovation, lack of record, lack of progress. But maybe it wasn't a dark age, maybe it was a blank one. You turn around and see the plaques behind you start to reorder themselves. 614, 800, 911, 1000. Like beads on a string being rearranged by an unseen hand. You remember the scriptorium, the scratch of knives on vellum. You remember the glass ceiling, the constellations that don't match the present. You remember the Pope who never existed. And now you start to wonder, was history lost? Or was it locked? Because locking something is cleaner. You don't burn it, you bury it in time. You wrap it in theology and bureaucracy and ritual until no one remembers how to ask the question. You step back into the main hall, where the bookshelves curve like rib cages, protecting a heart made of silence. And then, from somewhere deep within the stacks, you hear a whisper. You're not supposed to be here. It's not angry. Just tired. As if it said this to many wanderers before you. But you don't stop, because you've come this far. And the next hallway leads somewhere stranger. To the part of the archive where Gospels never canonized are filed. Between creaking drawers and broken seals, the kind of Gospels you're not supposed to read. But will. Soon. You follow the whisper. It winds through dust and darkness, curling around the base of ancient shelves, slipping between forgotten scrolls and crumbling bindings. It's not a voice, not exactly. More like memory given breath. And it leads you to a small drawer. Wooden, locked, but the lock is old, ornamental, and a gentle tug dislodges it with a tired sigh. Inside, parchment, flaky, yellowed, tied with a red thread. No gold leaf, no Vatican seal, no Latin flourish. Just a single title, written in a language you don't know, but which feels. Intimate. You unroll the first few lines, and just like that, the world shifts. Again. This Gospel doesn't begin with angels. It begins in a kitchen, a woman, barefoot, grinding herbs. Her name is Mariamne, not Mary Magdalene, not the prostitute, not the rebranded disciple, just Mariamne, teacher, companion, equal. Yes, you're reading one of the Gnostic Gospels. Possibly the Gospel of Mary, or something older, stranger. A gospel in which Jesus doesn't claim divine authority, but urges each listener to seek the kingdom within, where sin is not a crime against God, but an act of forgetting oneself. Historians still argue whether Mary Magdalene was actually the apostle to the apostles, as some early Christian texts suggest, or whether that title was quietly erased by men who found the idea inconvenient, quirky detail. In one Gnostic fragment, Peter outright complains about Mary. He says, "Surely the Saviour didn't speak these things to a woman." To which another disciple responds, "If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" It's not just sass, it's a window into an early Christianity that was chaotic, diverse, and contested. Multiple movements, competing stories, spiraling interpretations, and women teaching, leading, remembering. But then, something shifted. You picture a long wooden table. A meeting of bishops, the air thick with incense and compromise. The year is 325. Constantine watches. And one by one, they vote. On divinity, on eternity, on which stories live, and which are damned. One mainstream fact, the Council of Nicaea did not determine the New Testament canon that came later, but it did codify key doctrines about Jesus' divinity. It marked the start of official Christianity as imperial policy, and imperial policy prefers one story, a clean one. You roll the parchment back up, careful not to disturb the red thread too much. For a second, you imagine what the church would look like if this had been the dominant gospel. If Mariamne's voice had been taught in Sunday school. If sin was self-forgetting, and salvation came not through obedience, but through awakening. Would cathedrals smell of herbs and oil? Would sermons include silence? Would Judas be remembered not as a traitor, but as a mirror? You feel a presence beside you. Not a ghost, just ... expectancy. As if the very air is waiting to see what you do next. You smile, despite yourself, and whisper, "I'm still reading," and somewhere, through a crack in the archives, a gust of wind turns the page. The next gospel isn't even in words, just symbols, and a face you recognize. But it's not Jesus. It's someone the church tried very hard to delete. You follow the whisper. It winds through dust and darkness, curling around the base of ancient shelves, slipping between forgotten scrolls and crumbling bindings. It's not a voice, not exactly. More like memory given breath. And it leads you to A small drawer. Wooden, locked, but the lock is old, ornamental, and a gentle tug dislodges it with a tired side. Inside, parchment, flaky, yellowed, tied with a red thread. No gold leaf, no Vatican seal, no Latin flourish. Just a single title written in a language you don't know, but which feels intimate. You unroll the first few lines, and just like that, the world shifts. Again. This gospel doesn't begin with angels. It begins in a kitchen, a woman, barefoot, grinding herbs. Her name is Mariamne, not Mary Magdalene, not the prostitute, not the rebranded disciple, just Mariamne, teacher, companion, equal. Yes, you're reading one of the Gnostic Gospels. Possibly the Gospel of Mary, or something older, stranger. A gospel in which Jesus doesn't claim divine authority, but urges each listener to seek the kingdom within, where sin is not a crime against God, but an act of forgetting oneself. Historians still argue whether Mary Magdalene was actually the apostle to the apostles, as some early Christian texts suggest, or whether that title was quietly erased by men who found the idea inconvenient, quirky detail. In one Gnostic fragment, Peter outright complains about Mary. He says, "Surely the Saviour didn't speak these things to a woman." To which another disciple responds, "If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" It's not just sass, it's a window into an early Christianity that was chaotic, diverse, and contested. Multiple movements, competing stories, spiraling interpretations, and women teaching, leading, remembering. But then, something shifted. You picture a long wooden table. A meeting of bishops, the air thick with incense and compromise. The year is 325. Constantine watches. And one by one, they vote. On divinity, on eternity, on which stories live, and which are damned. One mainstream fact, the Council of Nicaea did not determine the New Testament canon that came later, but it did codify key doctrines about Jesus' divinity. It marked the start of official Christianity as imperial policy, and imperial policy prefers one story, a clean one. You roll the parchment back up, careful not to disturb the red thread too much. For a second, you imagine what the church would look like if this had been the dominant gospel. If Mariamne's voice had been taught in Sunday school. If sin was self-forgetting, and salvation came not through obedience, but through awakening. Would cathedrals smell of herbs and oil? Would sermons include silence? Would Judas be remembered not as a traitor, but as a mirror? You feel a presence beside you. Not a ghost, just expectancy. As if the very air is waiting to see what you do next. You smile, despite yourself, and whisper, "I'm still reading," and somewhere, through a crack in the archives, a gust of wind turns the page. The next gospel isn't even in words, just symbols, and a face you recognize. But it's not Jesus. It's someone the church tried very hard to delete. You stare at the face, drawn in crude ink and faded ochre. It peers out from the parchment with unnerving clarity. Hooded eyes, high cheekbones, a knowing tilt to the mouth. The image is surrounded by spirals, hands, snakes, suns, symbols of transformation. His name, if you dare to read it aloud, is Simon. Yes, that's Simon, not Peter, not the rock. Simon the Magus, the sorcerer, the heretic. The Manax of the Apostles tried to discredit with a single tale of hubris and humiliation offering to buy the Holy Spirit. But this gospel doesn't mock him. It honors him. You read slowly, the symbols washing over you like fire and rain. In this story, Simon is not a fraud, but a rival apostle. A man who believes salvation came through knowledge, not sacrifice. Who claimed he, too, was divine. Mainstream fact. Simon Magus was a real historical figure mentioned in early Christian texts, often portrayed as the archetypal false teacher, but he had followers. Lots of them. And here's the quirky bit. Some Gnostic sects believe Simon was an incarnation of the divine spirit, that he traveled with a woman named Helena, whom he had rescued from a brothel, claiming she was the first thought of God, trapped in flesh. Historians still argue whether Simon was a real threat to early Christianity or simply a scapegoater. Mirror held up to everything the church wanted to suppress. You imagine what that would look like to rival schools, Paul and Peter preaching faith and obedience, Simon teaching magic and memory, a spiritual Cold War beneath the Roman sun. And you understand, suddenly, why someone might want to erase him, because Simon doesn't kneel, he transforms. He doesn't confess, he remembers. He doesn't fear the divine. He becomes it, and just like that, the parchment crumbles a little more in your hands. You look around, suddenly aware of how many of these stories have no copies, no backups, just brittle scrolls in rooms no one visits. You press your palm gently to Simon's drawn face, not out of belief, but respect. Then you blink. And now, the room is gone. You're standing somewhere else, a temple, maybe, but it smells like ink and sounds like fire. You walk between flames that do not burn. Scrolls hiss as they curl into ash. Walls tremble with the pressure of lost voices. And at the center of this temple, or is it a memory? There stands a table. On the table, books. Bound, heavy, sealed, with wax. One bears a name that makes you exhale. Enoch. Another, the Book of Jubilees. A third has no name, only a sigil of wings and wheels. You know these. Or you've heard whispers, texts once revered by early Jewish and Christian sects, then banished, left out, buried. Mainstream fact: the Book of Enoch was considered scripture by some early Christians, even quoted in the New Testament, Jude 1:14. It describes angels descending, secrets of the cosmos, and visions of the Messiah long before the Gospels. But eventually, the church deemed it to strange, too mystical, too crowded with heavenly beings and cryptic symbols, and so it was locked away. Historians still argue whether these books were excluded for theological reasons or political convenience. After all, a church built on order doesn't like world visions of angelic rebellion and cosmic secrets, quirky detail. The Book of Jubilees rewrites Genesis. Entire genealogies reshaped, holidays redefined, timelines tightened like corsets. It was a divine editor's fever dream. You flip one open, the letters swim, like they remember you. They speak of watchers, angels who fell in love with humans. Of children born to toil for this world, of calendars, solar ones that once ruled the year before the lunar compromises. And here's the kicker: these books claim to know the true calendar, the one set by the heavens, not Caesar, not Constantine. You think back to that quiet shift when the Sabbath moved from Saturday to Sunday, when Passover became Easter, when the rhythm of sacred time bent to imperial will. You realize now, time itself was rewritten. To hide what? To favor whom? You pick up the unnamed book, the one with wings and wheels, and you feel a pulse. No joke. A heartbeat. You open it, and the air fills with the sound of turning wheels, spinning eyes, voices chanting in a language you don't know but deeply understand. It's not madness. It's memory, and you're remembering something the world forgot on purpose. You hold the book tight. You are standing in the fire, but you are not burned. Not yet. You are not standing in a temple anymore. Now it's a basilica, cold stone underfoot, gold leaf on every arch, stained glass bleeding colored light across marble saints. And at the center of it all, beneath the dome, is a circle inlaid in brass. Calendar, you've seen it before, maybe in Rome, maybe in a book, maybe in a dream. 12 signs, 12 months, a sun at the center, but something single quote says ... off. The solstices are shifted, the equinoxes misaligned, the feast days all wrong. Mainstream fact: Pope Gregory XIII reformed the Julian calendar in 1582 to better align with the solar year. Leap years were adjusted, 10 days were dropped. The world jolted forward, and the calendar clicked into its new rhythm. But not everyone agreed. Protestant countries refused to switch for over a century. Orthodox churches still haven't. Some argue that the Gregorian reform wasn't just a correction, but a redirection, a choice, a statement. Historians still debate whether the Gregorian calendar was imposed for astronomical accuracy or ecclesiastical authority. After all, controlling the calendar means controlling Easter. And Easter sets the rhythm for nearly everything. Quirky bit. In 1752, Britain jumped from September 2nd to September 14th overnight. People reportedly rioted, demanding, "Give us back our 11 days." You walk around the brass circle, you count, you realize that this version of time, this neat, imperial order, is like a fence around something much older. A garden, maybe. Wild, UNTAMED. You remember the books from before. Enoch's solar calendar, Jubilee's sacred weeks. You wonder if the rhythm of the divine had 13 months, not 12. If the moon once ruled, not just reflected. And now you understand the deeper conspiracy. When time was rewritten, memory was broken. Where Easter replaced Passover, a Jewish Messiah became a Roman god. When suns replaced seasons, nature became dogma. You kneel on the brass circle, you press your ear to the floor, and you hear it tick tock. But it's not a clock. It's a door, and it's opening. You fall through the door, or maybe you descend. Hard to say. One moment you're in a basilica, and the next you're in a stone vault, lit by nothing but oil lamps. The air is thick leathery with parchment, metallic with ink, and just a hint of rose. You know this smell. It's old knowledge. Forbidden pages, shelves surround you, scrolls, codices, tablets. But at the center of the room sits a single wooden lectern, and on it bound in cracked red leather is the Gospel according to Judas. Yes, that Judas. Mainstream fact. In 2006, the National Geographic Society unveiled a Coptic manuscript known as the Gospel of Judas, dating to the 3rd or 4th century. It portrays Judas not as a traitor but as the most trusted disciple, the only one who understood Jesus' true message. You open it, and it's not betrayal you read. It's instruction. In this version, Jesus laughs at the other disciples, calls them dull, tells Judas he alone will help release the spirit from the prison of flesh, that the crucifixion is not defeat, but escape. Quirky bit. The manuscript had been hidden in a cave in Egypt, rediscovered in the 1970s, passed through black markets, kept in a bank vault, mishandled, decayed, and almost lost again. Historians still argue whether this text reflects early Gnostic belief or is just a late heretical offshoot. But the questions it raises won't leave you. What if sacrifice was never the point? What if the real story was sabotage? What if the betrayal was a plan all along? You run your fingers down the script. Coptic letters curl like vines. You whisper a phrase aloud. And suddenly, you see him. Judas. Not hang. Not damned, but standing beside a well. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't run. He smiles and nods. As if to say, you've finally caught up. Judas fades, not vanishes. Just blurs. Like mist pulling back into the forest, you're alone again. But not empty. The gospel still lies open. The ink shimmers slightly, like the words are breathing, like they're alive or want to be. You turn the page. Now it's not Judas speaking. It's Mary. Not the mother. The Magdalene. Mainstream fact. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in the late 19th century, exists only in fragments. But what remains is bold. Mary recounts teachings Jesus gave in private. When Peter questions her authority, she stands firm. She was not just a follower. She was a knower. In this vault of forbidden texts, her words stretch wider than scripture. She speaks of illusion, of the material world as shadow, of ascending past powers and fears. Her voice is calm, but it cuts through stone like water. Quirky bit. Mary's Gospel was found wrapped in papyrus, alongside a manual of dream interpretation suggesting early Christians took dreams far more seriously than sermons. Historians still argue whether Mary Magdalene was a disciple, a visionary, or something greater, silenced because her message threatened not Rome, but hierarchy itself. You sit, you listen, because now the vault speaks, one voice, then another. Gospels you've never heard, of Philip, of Thomas, of truth. Each whispers from its place on the shelf, and you realize this isn't heresy. Its volume. Not one gospel, but a library. Not a single truth, but a garden of voices, each root bending toward light in its own way. The church once locked these doors, called them dangerous, but maybe they were just loud, too loud to fit inside a single altar. You breathe in the dust of what was buried. And now it lives again. Wind down, 300 words, and now, with your thoughts still echoing through ancient stone corridors, we soften the pace. The lamps flicker lower. The texts on the shelves grow quiet, not silenced, only resting, waiting for another mind to open their doors. The vault is not sealed, it never was, just forgotten, pushed behind fresher walls and louder voices. You take a slow breath. The scent of old paper and warm oil lingers in your nose. There's a calm in it, a weight, a sense that truth doesn't scream. It waits outside this vault. The world spins by electric time, seconds chased by algorithms, but in here, time folds, becomes circular, sacred, like breath, the kind of time where a whisper lasts longer than a sermon, and yes, you carry that whisper now. Maybe you'll forget it by morning, or maybe one line, one scent, one shadow will stay, just enough to remind you, history wasn't lost. It was locked. And you found the key. So close your eyes, just for now. Let the voices return to the shelves. Let the past cradle you like parchment. In a patient hand, let the vault hum, soft and low, behind your thoughts. And let sleep take you. Gently. Quietly. Like a secret returning home.